and that the original was so greatly superior in terms of the construction of its edge than what we could do today. And that in itself is it's just such an incredible feeling, because often I think as historians maybe we view it differently, but I think that when we look at the public at large, we tend to have we see a tendency that the further back in time we move, the more cartoonized human beings tend to become, that we can't imagine them to the people of the past to be on a similar level to us. We almost don't see them like people in the same sense.
May I just come in and say I fully agree with you, but this is very Western and European.
Yeah.
Not in Iranians, Chinese, Japanese. We don't look at this like that. It's very European. Because, I think it's also, in my opinion, part of the movement in Europe of Renaissance, which bedeviled everything medieval as Dark Age.
Yes.
And I think from there, it starts in European mind.
Absolutely. And I think certainly, and I was speaking from personal experience rather than a kind of a global view, but I think certainly the problem I've seen is that we tend to look at historical figures, not just the ordinary people, but even the most famous people in history. We look at them as if they're characters in a book,
yes,
rather than real human beings. And something like that Bronze Age experiment, to know that somebody the person who created that original piece had the knowledge passed down to them from generation to generation to generation, to such a magnificent level of knowledge, with no modern technology to actually assist in this, but just pure skill and this transmission. And yet here we are sitting in the 21st century trying to figure out how they did it. With everything.
You know what humbles us as we know, Persian crucible steel is the best crucible steel, as everyone admits, as far as crucible steel is concerned. Many people replicated crucible steel. No one can replicate the beauty. And if they do a small one of the so-called Damascus steel or crucible pattern crucible steel of Timurid or Safavid period Persia, no one in today's world. And everyone in these studies know that. Because, when you come to Persian or to Japanese or even to Chinese quality blades, the quality of the blade, the patterns of the blade is, look at the Japanese Nihonto. Many of those patterns cannot be replicated, although Japanese kept their tradition. They kept the tradition of sword making. And we are talking about, and now when you go back to bronze, as you said, I mean, even if you come later on, in Japan, you see it, in Persia, you see it, in Ottoman Empire, you see it, in China, you see it, because blades have patterns. It's very, it's clear to see that.
I don't know whether you ever ever heard about the discovery which was made not far from me, that what was the old Anglo-Saxon capital. It's about 16 miles north of me. It's now a very fine Norman castle. And there was a custodian who had passed away, and I believe they were clearing out his personal collection and looking for things that would obviously go into the museum. And one thing that came up was simply a corroded bar, maybe about, I don't know, maybe about just under a meter in length. And it was I believe it was a young archaeologist who actually thought that looks like the dimensions of an Anglo-Saxon sword, and it turned out to be a 6th or early 7th century 5-bar pattern weld, unknown anywhere in the world at that point, or certainly unknown and unknown. They've most, I think, they've found a 3-bar pattern weld Anglo-Saxon sword. This one was 5 separate strands, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And this was sitting in a cupboard, undiscovered. It'd probably been filed away in a box, sitting undiscovered about 16 miles north of me. and where it came from, again, where there have been some computer generations of some computer images of, or some computer some artist impressions, computer generated artist impressions of what this thing may have looked like. But the idea of pattern welding 5 bars of steel sometime around about sort of 590, 600 AD is, you know, it makes you wonder. But I think this, you know, this is a very important thing for me. It's probably one of the main reasons why I do what I do, is to make people think, to get people to think, to say, we need to, you know, we can ask what it is and, you know, how does it work? But the question why is often the most fundamental question of all, because that leads us into so many different territories as to why did somebody create this thing in the way they did, you know, and what was the process that, you know, and this is true of so many things we look at, whether it be a manuscript or a martial tradition. It's not just understanding what it is and how it works, but why is it the way it is? And we can apply that. Certainly, that's been applied to, you know, to artifact, to sort of artifact research. But I think as an approach to certainly the martial art, to historical martial arts, and exploration of historical artifacts, it's a very, very useful way of looking at things.
Okay, Bob, let's move on to the second part of our interview, is about moral codes or principles and what you wanted to discuss. And I think this is something which is also very interesting for me, and what let me just talk about what I perceived, and I give the floor to you. You can explain. I started with different martial arts, and one of them is wrestling. Wrestling is in Iran holy, a sacred martial art. We say "Gode Muqaddas Kushti." And I also come from Kyokushin circle. Kyokushin Kai is a full contact bare knuckle. For those, I mean, everyone knows there are 11 million members worldwide. I mean, this is huge, but it's really, and I remember when Soke Oyama was there now as a black belt there, I know how traditional, hierarchical this organization is, and how hard and tough. But just, I repeat that, and I said it in many, many interviews here, but I repeat it for our viewers. The first World Kyokushin, there was no division. You need to have black belt to take part. Any other style was welcome, but I mean, well, we saw the results back then. But you know, you should at least be a black belt and weigh at least 75 kilos.
Yeah.
No less. And then you had guys who were 150, 160 kilos as well. All muscle. I'm not talking about overweight guys. The whole idea was black belts fight, because in a real self-defense situation, you cannot choose the weight. And lots of injuries happened. You know, and when you watch that, the first Kyokushin, you see that Sato, Sensei Sato, a very huge Japanese guy, who was a black belt in judo, black belt in Kyokushin, black belt in judo, and some other styles. He won it. Lots of broken bones, lots of bloodshed. When he won, the only thing he did was us. You couldn't even see smile. When he knocked out many people, or the others knocked each other out, there was always respect. In Kyokushin, when you knock someone down, you need to turn, sit down, and wait. And once they tell you, get up, and when you win, the first thing they do, they apologize to someone they knocked out or knocked down, or cannot continue.
Yeah.
This is the spirit of Kyokushin. And Kyokushin says, as Oyama says, without Budo and Bushido, creative full contact we become wild animals.
Yes.
And we are talking about Kyokushin guy. We know in MMA as well, Kyokushin is as legit as BJJ. Kyokushin is as legit as Muay Thai. We are talking about real tough styles, not if I do this and this. What I saw, and I remember, now I'm healed, my back is healed, my knees are healed. I'm going to make a video on that. I went back to Kyokushin circles where I belong to. I distanced myself completely from HEMA world. And I mentioned that for two reasons. The first reason, Bob, and I think we talked about it, was the lack of respect in this environment. Environments where people are not tough or do not fight for full contact. I'm not trying to, accuse anyone, but still think they are very tough, which is not a big problem that they are not tough. But if they behave like someone who, I mean, this is something without any principles, not nice. And the second thing was, I always ask myself, why there is competition everywhere, but in 11 million members organization, people get along with each other. And in a small community of HEMA, everyone is against the other. Okay, the reason was clear because there is no established. I mean, Kyokushin had its also divisions as well. I know, I'm aware of that. But in HEMA ward, and then I realized there are lots of tensions, and the tensions were going on more and more and more. And one thing also, I am going to say it openly, I observed some racist movements in HEMA, which I really didn't like, and I distanced myself. So I just give the floor to you to tell us, because you are a person, you're a HEMA instructor, one of few in this HEMA ward I have always respected thoroughly. You know that well. And that's why I just want to give the floor to you. And because many people who watch our channel, they come from Kyokushin circles, MMA circles, they come from boxing, Muay Thai. There are many police officers watching this from law enforcement and also military.
Yeah.
So please tell us what you have observed in this HEMA community, Bob.
So I think as a general overview, I've personally been on the journey that has seen a community grow from nothing. You could have put the number of people studying historical combat manuscripts in my kitchen in 1994 to today, the community being somewhere around about 15 to 20,000 people worldwide. It's not a very big, certainly not in terms of Kyokushin or anything like that. There's no comparison. The only way I can describe it, I think, from a personal perspective, is that the historical fence community is like a lot of other niche communities. Because there is no unifying structure, you almost have a perpetual power vacuum where people are pushing for to be noticed, to gain a reputation. And I think this is true of certainly in a lot of niche activities. I think it's true. Yes, there have been instances where very undesirable elements have attached themselves to the idea of a European martial arts purely for the reasons of identitarian politics. I would say that they are very, very strongly resisted certainly by the people I move in circles with. In terms of the respect and the competitions and the way that the tournaments that happen, this is a mixed bag for me. I think people want to compete because they like the idea of trying out what they have learned in a class. And over the years, certainly there's been the development of quite an active, I wouldn't say a tournament circuit, but I'd say certainly a tournament phenomenon within the HEMA community. And I have a number of issues with it. Although I do think that ultimately people should be free to choose what they want to do and where they want to do it. And there are, what I get out of HEMA is not necessarily what somebody else would, and that's true within my own school. There are people who I teach who are oriented towards competitions, and that's not an issue. I think where the issue lies, and where historical fencing certainly, or HEMA, is at variance with most other martial arts that are practiced, is weaponry. And by that, I mean, when we look at tournaments, we see effectively an attempt to approximate a sword fight, which by its very nature is at the more extreme end of interpersonal violence before we get to firearms. When people arm themselves with weapons, everything changes. Martial arts which depend on the body, where we look at, you know, the grappling or the striking arts, in many respects, because again it's an establishment issue. I think but because there is not the because it's involving one's own body, one's own sense of touch, there is inherently more respect there. I think it's closer. Certainly, it's physically closer, and a lot of people I know within for example, the historical wrestling community, you know, talk about this. Not a lot of people like to get very up close and personal. It's an uncomfortable thing for certainly for new students. You have to become used to this idea of working in very close proximity to another human being, especially where that interaction is violent. When we add weapons in, things happen. Weapons will increase the measure between two combatants. It becomes the greater the distance, certainly the less personal it becomes. And we only have to look at, you know, if you look at a book like On Killing, and look at the psychological effects of deadly combat at various ranges, we see that the further we move away, the less psychological trauma tends to be associated with the act of killing. And I don't necessarily just want to talk about the act of killing, but it's important because this is, and it should always be, the most extreme end of the scale when it comes to the outcome of any martial art. You know, we see boxers die in the ring. Sadly, it happens. Neither of those boxers goes out with the intention to kill the other. There is an unwritten social contract between anybody participating in a combat sport, where the well-being of the other person is paramount. And this is always, we know this is, and we certainly know from the historical record, we know that this is something that goes back to the formations of the first military advice, where soldiers, you know, for example, Roman legionaries training with one another. Yes, some bruising is acceptable, but that person you're training with is lending you their body to develop your skills. And the problem when we introduce weapons, especially when the psychological side of fighting with weapons has not been addressed, is a propensity to think that, well, this sword's only made of, or this sword doesn't have any sharp edges, therefore it's safer than a sharp sword. And we then see the development of weapons that are made from different materials. And certainly in the HEMA community, we've seen everything from the use of modified shinai right the way through to the creation of long swords made from nylon, made from hard nylon. And the idea has been there that, well, you know, nylons are great for beginners because they're safer than giving a beginner a steel longsword. And in fact, what we see is the reverse, that the nylon longsword is still a dangerous weapon. It is harder than your skull, and it doesn't feel pain, and it can't be injured. It can be broken. Doesn't matter if it's broken. If your head's broken, it's a different story. And when we introduce weapons, because these are no longer cutting. The emphasis is no longer on edge trauma, because we know that it takes very little effort to cut the human body. We can cut the human body with a piece of paper. When we introduce weapons that are not sharp, they become force multipliers. Very, very simple. You are no longer, if you're using a sharp sword, you don't need to put in very much strength. to cause a devastating injury to an opponent. If you remove that and you replace it with a sword that has no edges, the tendency is to strike harder and harder and harder to make things work. And the answer to that within the HEMA community is to add more and more plastic armor, reinforced fencing masks, to simulate fencing without armor. That's the irony. Simulate fencing without armor by wearing a padded jacket, huge reinforced fencing mask with an occipital protector, gigantic reinforced gauntlets, and you're simulating fencing with no armor by wearing armor. Makes no sense to me. But the tournaments require this now because the standard is to hit as hard as you can. And when we read the manuscripts, there is advice repeated. If you fence with too much strength, this is a base element. This is something that they call them in medieval German manuscripts buffalo. This is what buffalo do. In Italian medieval manuscripts, they refer to as villani, peasants. This is uncultured, it's rough, it's uncouth. This is what untrained people do. Because most people out there, unfortunately, do not realize that anybody, and I mean this, anybody can hit anybody hard with no training at all.
Absolutely, I agree.
Why do we train? And this leads me to the issue of, again, morality, the whole idea of the social contract between martial artists who are in not only training together, but often will find themselves in competition with one another. And it relates to a question I am often asked or often see asked. And this is, do you guys do full contact? Now, to me, full contact is a very loaded term. It can have so many different meanings because we know that there are full contact martial arts, Kyokushin, MMA. But even though they're full contact, they're only using the body, and there are rules. Once you say full contact with this, the forces I generate at the end of this thing are enormous. Full contact with that, I will kill you through your mask. And this is a problem because there's a prevalent feeling that because we wear all this gear, we can hit as hard as we like without consequence. And in fact, we see from some of the tournaments out there, and again, this isn't necessarily the fault of the organizers, this is the fault of the competitors. We see injuries, including 16 stitches in the scalp through a fencing mask, broken arms, stab wounds. This is unacceptable because nobody goes into a tournament with the idea, nobody goes into a tournament with the idea that, well, I might come out of this and need hospital treatment. And this is a fundamental problem, and it simply relates to this idea that, well, we're taking precautions. I can go harder with this weapon because the guy who I'm fencing against is wearing all this protective gear, without understanding that that weapon is designed for precision use with a sharp edge, requires very little to cause a fight-finishing injury to an adversary. But the other problem I have, and this is a fundamental problem I have, is that, and I hear this so often, and I see it so often, and I read it so often, that I can no longer ignore it. And that is the idea that, and it's true of almost every HEMA tournament out there, the optimal goal of a HEMA tournament is to kill your adversary, is to replicate killing your adversary. The top triangle is scored the highest. Blows to the extended target or the legs generally scored the lowest. Torso, somewhere in between. My question is, if we're scoring 5 points for hitting this triangle, we are rewarding murder. Simply. That's what we're rewarding. We are saying that the optimal outcome for this fight is to kill, or this bout, this simulation that we're doing is to kill your opponent. When we look at the manuscripts, and Messer again, when we look at the manuscripts and we look at the plates that show techniques, and they're often, for example, Fiore de Libri, early 15th century Italian fencing master, shows the use of the dagger. 76 players of the dagger, and they are made up of locks, disarms, breaks, and throws. In not one instance is he killing anybody. Why is that? Not to say that he can't, but what they're telling us, and the Messer does the same thing, the vast majority of Messer material, what we see depicted in the pages with a few exceptions, is non-lethal. And this is at the very heart of being a human being. It is the most extreme action a human being can take to end the life of another human being. And they understood this 500 years ago, but today we fantasize about ending the lives of other human beings, and we even play games to replicate it. And I have a problem with that. Because unless people see what this sharp does to somebody's head, they don't understand it. And they pretend that because they play sword games, that they somehow are equipped for the most extreme level of real-world violence that a human being can probably come across today. I've said to people, if you think you are a badass swordsman, go to Central America, buy a cheap machete, call somebody a pussy, and see what happens. Then you'll test how good you are. But stop pretending that you are a killing machine, because you're not. You're not a medieval soldier. You're not a Renaissance soldier. You're not a Cossack horseman. You are a hobbyist playing at swords. But this fascination with death and murder, I've had enough of it. And I arm all of my students with this advice. If you enter a bout with somebody who does not have your safety at heart, you have every right to walk away. Leave the bout, refuse defense. Because this idea, and I see people writing things like, for example, somebody will demonstrate a technique in a video or put it up, and of course it's somebody getting hit in the head or stabbed through the face or stabbed through the body in metaphorically with the action of a fencing sword. And somebody will put killing with style. And recently I've begun to ask the question, tell me how killing somebody is stylish.